Welcome to Season 2, Episode 2, Chronicles of UK Salafism, an Insider Perspective. And this podcast shall cover the year 2001. Because of the disruptive nature of this particular year, this podcast is likely to be longer than others. I think it's important to cover events comprehensively and to enlighten the listener on perspectives and developments as they occurred on a microcosmic level within the wider macro level of events that we are all familiar with now, by and large. Now, as I'd mentioned in the previous episode, Salafis were placed on the back foot in this particular decade, especially this year, and were also targeted because of our practices and beliefs, which were socially conservative within a very liberal and open society. There were agendas there from Muslims who espoused such liberalism and non-Muslim liberal entities, groups like Henry Jackson Society within the Muslim communities, the Quilliam Foundation, which was to emerge later on in the noughties. Salafis were not overly surprised by the attacks themselves, due to the previous decade in which the communities up and down the country were combating and countering the violent extremist narrative, very successfully at that. Hizb ut-Tahrir were on the back foot and in a defensive mode whenever Salafis were turning up in their lectures or were on the campuses across the universities. The Khariji Takfiri ideology that was being espoused by the personalities that I mentioned in the previous decade, Abdullah al-Faisal, Abu Hamza, Abu Qatada, Omar Bakri, were being countered vociferously by the Salafi communities up and down the country. So there wasn't a surprise because of the experience in the religion, in the ideology, on what extremism looked like and how the protagonists and their followers would behave. What was surprising, however, was the audacity and scale of the attacks due to their magnitude. Because whilst many of us held them to be advocates of terrorism, we were surprised at the capability, the apparent capability to enact such attacks, because their capacity wasn't such. And that led to, and continues to lead to, a lot of surrounding suspicion on how these attacks were orchestrated. They happened, the perpetrators are known, but there was complicity, and that's the general feeling from many who continue to look at the events that changed the Western world at that time in 2001. Continuing, I'll focus on some of the sermons that were delivered in 2001, and then I will go off tangentially to refer to some other events that interrupted the nature of those sermons and how they developed for the rest of the year. So the first sermon, the first khutbah that I delivered, these were mainly in Brixton, was on the 5th of January 2001, entitled The Effect of Sins and the Need to Enjoin Good Among Ourselves and Forbid Evil. On the 26th of January, the next sermon was on backbiting, slander, and tale carrying, namima. The 16th of February saw me deliver a sermon entitled Sincerity, and this was based on the translated works of Sheikh Hudayfi. And then on the 9th of March, I delivered a sermon called Mankind's Greatest Need, which was a focus on Tawheed, monotheism. In April, and I haven't got the exact date, but it would be a Friday, I delivered a sermon, Who is the Victorious Group? And this was a review on narrations regarding the successful entity, the successful adherence to the truth in Islam. Many are aware of the narrations referring to the saved sect and the 73 sects in Islam. And so it was a focus around that particular topic. On the 13th of April, a lecture was delivered, sorry, a khutbah was delivered, The Reality of Easter. And in that sermon, the origin of Easter was discussed. And on the 11th of May, the sermon was entitled Gratitude to Allah. A week later, on the 18th, I delivered a sermon entitled The Dilemma Facing the Youth. And on the 7th of September, I delivered a sermon called A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. This is where I will pause with the sermons to address events preceding 9/11. And I think this is important because the ensuing sermons were emphatically affected by the events around September 11th. In spring of 2001, Abdulrahim, also known as Richard Reid, who was to later become known as the Shoe Bomber, his mother contacted us at the mosque. She is non-Muslim, white British lady. His father was of West Indian extraction. And she called because she hadn't heard from Abdulrahim for a little while. He was in frequent contact with his mother, but he had not been in contact with her for a few months since he'd come out of prison those years before converting to Islam. Now, we said we would make inquiries amongst some of the colleagues who knew him, and in contacting them, they had also confirmed a lack of contact for a few months. Now, we know that he had traveled to Pakistan, and no one had issue with that because other individuals had traveled to Pakistan to learn the Quran and they returned. Some returned more fervent in their practice of Islam, and others became more liberal and stopped practicing Islam. I'm not attributing that to their travels to Pakistan. It just may be where they were with their particular development in Islam at that particular time. Now, we had already asked Abdulrahim not to return to the mosque. I, in particular, as the chairman, on the last encounter I had with him, told him he wasn't welcome there anymore. And I recall him coming down the stairs as I entered the front door of the mosque, and he was wearing khaki trousers. I'm not saying that had anything to do with anything, but I remember seeing him and he had a brown jacket on. And Abdulrahim, by his nature, was quite a shy individual, very amiable and non-confrontational with those of us who were in the leadership of the mosque. So when he saw me, his head was down and we exchanged few words, but that was the last time that I was to see him. And his mother was informed of that. Proceeding from there, and what happened in the spring of that spring of that year, we're moved towards the summer because I want to embark upon another significant event for not only the local Salafi community, but others from around the UK. It included my religious instruction, and it was none other than the Ibn Taymiyyah Seminar in Brixton, which was co-hosted with Call to Islam in Luton. And that was to be a seminar delivered by 3 Jordanian shuyukh and one from Egypt. On the 8th of August was its commencement date, and it was to complete on the 17th of the same month. Now, I want to refer to the flyers and the details that I still have for that seminar. But before doing so, I will refer to the previous episode in which I highlighted the fissures, the cracks appearing ever so more amongst the various Salafi communities in the UK. And As a result of this particular seminar, we had to consult the scholars in Jordan because our counterparts in Birmingham, the emerging cults, as I refer to them, were becoming renowned for ensuring that their conferences fell on the same date as the other communities around the country. They were the last to be delivering conferences, but they were becoming the more forceful in trying to get their dates as the ones where everyone should be attending. Now, in speaking to the scholars, they came up with an agreement. We spoke to the Jordanian scholars, as I've mentioned, and I've got the agreement here that was eventually agreed between the two parties, three parties, because we had Call to Islam aligned with us with this seminar we were going to deliver. So I'll read this briefly. And we started it, joint announcement from Masjid Ibn Taymiyyah, Brixton, and Salafi Publications, Birmingham. And it started with the verse of the Quran, Surah Ali Imran, the third chapter, verse 103, English rendition being, and hold fast all of you together to the rope of Allah and be not divided amongst yourselves. End of quote. And the rest of the agreement went as follows. Alhamdulillah, after consulting the shuyukh, we have arranged to amend the dates of the Islamic classes and Ibn Taymiyyah Seminar due to be held at our respective centres. This is to accommodate the requests of those wanting to benefit from all the shuyukh visiting the UK at the time by attending 2 or more of the August events mentioned below. Some of the shuyukh have commitments to deliver a series of lectures abroad. They need to travel immediately after finishing the first 2 programmes, the conference and seminar. This is another reason for amending the programmes. It is not very often that we are all able to host the number of people of knowledge that are about to visit us. It is therefore essential that we provide everyone the opportunity to benefit from them, inshallah. The 3rd to the 6th of August 2001, date for Salafi Publications Conference in Birmingham remains unchanged. To enable brothers and sisters to first attend the Birmingham conference, the Ibn Taymiyyah Seminar in London, sponsored by Masjid Ibn Taymiyyah and Call to Islam, will now begin on the 7th of August and end the 14th of August. Salafi Publications' earlier announced week of Islamic classes following their conference will now begin on the 14th of August. And to conclude, revised schedules will now be provided shortly, inshallah. The duration of the classes at the Ibn Taymiyyah Seminar will be extended to ensure that the content and quality of the program is not affected in any way. We apologize for any inconvenience caused by these amendments. We have made these changes seeking Allah's pleasure, and with Him lies the tawfiq. And we compiled this particular agreement at the behest of the Jordanian scholars, again, who arbitrated and arranged these dates. Now, referring to this seminar, usually I refer to my notes, the pages, and some of the subjects that are covered. At this juncture, I want to highlight this seminar, which was a first for us in the Brixton Mosque community, and also for Call to Islam. And I think the nature of it was a first amongst the Salafi communities in the UK. We see nowadays many seminars being hosted by institutes and they're very comprehensive, and courses are being delivered, and very good courses at that on many occasions. However, for the Salafi community in the UK, this was a first from what I recall. So the flyer read Islamic Studies course, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah Seminar, a seminar designed and taught by distinguished sheikhs. And the sheikhs that were listed were Sheikh Mohammed Musa Nasa, rahimahullah, who died a few years ago in travel in Saudi Arabia while he was performing Umrah, or about to perform Umrah. Sheikh Ali Hassan Al-Halabi, Sheikh Usama Al-Kursi from Egypt, Sheikh Salim Al-Hilali. And we stated here, it offers students the rare opportunity to study 4 fundamental subjects of Islam in a thorough, intensive manner with well-known sheikhs. Okay, and the address was Iqra Independent School, which was next door. That was our local community school next door to Brixton Mosque. And we ended it at the bottom with a hadith from narrated by Abu Huraira that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Whoever treads the path of knowledge, Allah will make easy for him the path to paradise." Narrated by Muslim. An opportunity not to be missed by any serious seeker of knowledge. Now, I won't go into detail about the actual course descriptor because that would be me reading half a page again. But we basically invited the participant to attend one, if not four, of the courses that would be on offer. And the courses were the Quran and its Sciences by Sheikh Mohammed Musa Nasser, the Principles of Fiqh by Sheikh Ali Hassan Al-Halabi, Aqidah and Manhaj by Sheikh Usama Al-Kusi, and Hadith and its Terminology by Sheikh Salim Al-Hilali. And it was highlighted that there would be a certificate at the end of this. The fees, course fees were given, and the date of final registration was given on that. This was a resoundingly successful program in August. The attendance was such that we had to move the men attendees, applicants, into what was then the Abeng Centre, now the Karibu Centre, community hall, and we kept the school, Ikra school, for the sisters who were attending. And I can talk about the structure of the course in the reports that were given to each of us, provided we passed with 60% or more. And I've got my report here, Abdul Baker, and in fiqh and its usul, my mark was 92%, grade excellent. Ulum al Hadith, 85%, grade very good. Aqidah, 94%, grade excellent. Ulum al Quran, 85%, grade very good. And the final total was 89, very good. So I was successful in passing this particular seminar. And then we were awarded certificates that were signed and officially stamped by the teachers, our teachers. And we had here the Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah Seminar certificate, Markaz al-Imam al-Bani for studies of manhaj and academic research, Amman, Jordan, certifies, and it provides my name, has successfully completed level 1 of the Islamic Studies course, which took place in Brixton, London, between 16th and 21st of Jumad al-Ula, 1422, corresponding with the 6th and 11th of August 2001. Some may ask, well, didn't you say that the course was going to be for longer than that? When the seminar was taking place, after the seminar, we had lectures and a mini conference in the mosque until the end of the period that I first highlighted. And then we have here the statement from the scholars on the certificate. We hope for your continued success, and we advise you to have taqwa of Allah in secret and in public with this beneficial knowledge, as well as to call to it upon the methodology of the pious predecessors. And we have Sheikh Ali Hassan Ali Al-Halabi, teacher of fiqh and its usul, Sheikh Usama Kusi, teacher of Aqidah, Sheikh Salim Eid Al-Hilali, teacher of Ulum Al-Hadith, Sheikh Dr. Mohammed Musa Nasser, teacher of Ulum Al-Quran. And they've all got their Arabic stamps on those certificates. So that was the seminar that took place just under a month, you could say, before the tragic events and seismic events of September 11th occurred. It's now important to refer to the most major event of that year and new decade, the 11th of September, which was a Tuesday. And I would like to recount some of the events of that day as we look at what transpired immediately after that. As I mentioned, it was a Tuesday, and I remember it was a special day for me and my family because my oldest daughter started secondary school in Tooting. I was working at the Department for Education and Skills, as they were called at that time, and I was in the IT department, the National Grid for Learning, NGFL. So we were the computer or IT based sector of the Department for Education. Now, when the events began to unfold of 9/11, I remember one or two colleagues bemused looking on their computers and saying to others what was unfolding. And I remember one of them, it was a sort of dark humor, mentioned that this was like something out of King Kong because no one could believe it was that serious. And as the news started rolling in, the television from the conference room was wheeled into our section and switched on. So we started watching live what was actually happening. Now, as a practicing Muslim and in middle management, I was wearing my thobe, the only one who would wear a thobe, just like we had an Orthodox Jew who worked in the same section, so he was practicing. But there was no issue because of the diversity of working in as a civil servant. Now, I remember some became very alarmed, and then focus started drawing on buildings, Canary Wharf, and places like that in case copycat or sequential terrorist strikes were going to take place. I'm using the term terrorist because I was there sitting thinking they're going to blame the Muslims. And lo and behold, as the first tower collapsed, as we were watching the news, they started attributing this to Muslims without any evidence, which was quite alarming for me and the Muslim world, to be frank. At the end of the day, it was coming close to, or it was actually Asr prayer, and I left to get to the mosque because we'd arranged for an emergency meeting. When I got to St James's Park underground station, because my office was, the building was close by, I decided to do a U-turn and went back and prayed in the prayer hall and in the basement of the department because I felt to myself, would I even be secure enough and safe enough to get to Brixton in time to pray my Asr prayer? When arriving in Brixton, through an atmosphere of increasing alarm and shock from travelers, commuters, the community management sat down and started discussing next steps and what should be done. Public statements, contacting the leader of the local council to condemn this, even though we didn't know who it was, but to show a solidarity that we were against this type of violence, these types of attacks. Um, there was genuine or general, should I say, solidarity amongst all of us about the attacks, but the urgency was something that varied between all of us. The committee that was responsible for the Islamic education and instruction did not seem to think it was such an issue to take as seriously, and that whilst it was important, it wasn't urgent to have a knee-jerk reaction as such. And I understand that to a degree, but I feel the casualness with which they approached, or some members of them approached this, was left a lot to be desired from the remaining section of the management, which was the administration, strategic direction body. In any event, we discussed that this would need to be spoken about in the forthcoming sermon on the Friday, and that would be prepared and I would deliver that particular sermon. Over the course of the next few days, one member of the community, who's since passed, he traveled to Jordan. He was scheduled to travel to Jordan anyway. So we asked him to speak to the Jordanian scholars to get their advice, which he did. And I remember us ringing on a conference call and speaking with the scholars, and it being translated what their advice was, which was quite emphatic advice, which was such that if it emerges that this is from a Khariji extremist perspective, we mustn't engage in name calling and mudslinging because we just don't like individuals, especially if there's no evidence. We should stick and speak about what Islam stands for and what Islam doesn't stand for. And on the whole, that is how we proceeded. And I will address the being put on the spot by the media at the beginning of the next podcast because there's a lot to discuss around that and the accusations that emanated from there. But I want to read the first sermon that was delivered on the 14th of September, immediately after this catastrophic event for Muslim communities, Muslim societies, Western societies. And I remember the atmosphere that day was one that could be cut with a knife. Individuals we'd seen and knew confirmed they'd come from all over London to hear the sermon. They wanted to hear what the address was going to be. And just before I touch upon excerpts of the sermon, I remember coming out of the underground from work and I saw an old friend who I used to rave with. And he looked at me and we both had a solemn expression. And he said one thing to me that I reiterated in the sermon. And he's a non-Muslim, remember. And he said to me, my brother, as he knew us before Islam, the bully got a bloody nose. And that shocked me hearing that from him. The bully got a bloody nose, meaning America. I incorporated that into a part of the khutbah just to reiterate that a non-Muslim had this observation, which was the first indication of some of the non-Muslim sentiment alongside the shock, horror, terror. So starting with the sermon and excerpts of it, I started as usual with the khutbat al-haja, and then I said, quote, "The events of the past week have shocked all of us, with people polarized at two extremes, those who are despairing about what has happened and those who are rejoicing. This sermon should look at how we as believers should behave in these times of fitna, turmoil, tribulation, which has been taking place long before the events of this week. Yet again, the actions of a few have caused a resounding effect upon the Muslims. Allah tells us in Surah Al-Anfal, the 8th Surah, Ayat 25, verse 25, the English rendition being, and fear the fitna, affliction and trials, which affects not in particular only those of you who do wrong, but it may afflict the good and bad people, and know that Allah is severe in punishment." Close quote. Then I stated, there are those of us who believe that there was nothing wrong in what happened on Tuesday, the 11th of September, and that everyone got what they deserved. Some of us believe this redresses the slaughter of innocent Muslims in our lands. On the other hand, there are those of us who are totally sympathetic with the victims to the extent that we witnessed Muslims, Jews, and Christians attending a church in Tottenham Court Road to share in prayers and unite in their grief. The confusion caused in this and other areas clearly shows that we are in a fitna. We are in a trial and a tribulation. So that was the first page of the sermon that I actually delivered. And at this point here, I want to move to the first few days afterwards as well, that weekend, the first weekend, the 15th and 16th of September, because things started rapidly accelerating that were going to shape and change much of the response of our community of Salafis locally and nationally and eventually internationally. But before doing so, I want to explain why the attendance that day was busier than usual. Brixton was always one of the busiest mosques in London because our sermons were always delivered in English, unlike the plethora of other mosques that delivered in their local dialects from the South Asian community. But many said that they'd come because they knew that we would address the issue, unlike many of the other mosques that barely mentioned anything. We even called out the extremist entities that had been propagating their call openly. Their propaganda had been openly, even giving newspaper interviews, media interviews about their extremist beliefs. And there was silence even from those quarters. This was one of the reasons why on this particular day, many said we had to come to Brixton. Moving to that weekend. Now, I had just rented a new home in Herne Hill, which was just near Brockwell Park. And it was a small cul-de-sac estate that was gated. And as we were settling family members in, I remember the door being knocked on either the Saturday, Sunday. I cannot recall the date, but it was that weekend. And when I went to the door, there were 4 or 5 white suited individuals, Americans. One of them flashed a badge at me, but I maintained eye contact with them because I didn't know who they were. But it was clear from their introduction they were from the American security services, CIA or FBI. I cannot recall which one. And they were sweating. The one who was at the door, his above his lip was sweating. He was hot. He looked very nervous and asked me for the name of a particular neighbor, which I directed him to. I think they live there. And so they started going up to that address. Now, I was about to leave anyway and told my family I'll be back shortly. As I was going out, you can only go one, there's only one entrance, one exit, the same. And the gates were shut. So I started moving my car down towards the gate, and the cars that were there blocking it on the other side would not move. Individuals got out of their car. A few hand movements under their jacket took place. I'm not going to say what that was. I'll leave it for the listener to discern. And it was clear that they were very nervous about something. And I saw them looking behind me. I turned and looked at the individual behind me, and it was one of those who'd knocked on the door. And I said, I'm leaving. I have to go up the road. Is there something you need from me? Do you need to speak to me about anything? And he said, no, but asked me who was I, what my name was. I gave him my name, and I actually gave him one of my business cards, which I was carrying at the time. I've got a copy of it in front of me now. Still have a few copies. The business card starts with in the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, Brixton Mosque and Islamic Culture Centre, Abdulrahim Baker, Chairman, and it gave my then number 07956 and my email address ahbaker@line1.net, and then the address of Brixton, its telephone number, and the registered charity number as well. I handed that to him. He looked beyond my shoulders behind me, and then I saw the car. One of the cars moved to the side, the other one pulled back, and I was able to go down. I've got the code, and I opened the gate and I went out. It was not more than 3 minutes when I received a phone call on my mobile phone, that number on the card, and it was one of them who introduced himself and said, "Can you return back to your premises immediately? We need to speak to you." I did a U-turn and parked and called one of the committee members and said, please call my lawyer. I suspect or surmise there's going to be some problems. And I explained to him what was happening. When I went back and met these individuals, they spoke in more detail, said that they are here because of obviously what happened in 9/11, and they're following some leads. But this was regarding Zacarias Moussaoui, who had been arrested prior to 9/11 for visa violations, and the suspicions around him grew because he was taking flight lessons at the time, and he only wanted to learn how to take off but not land. So this drew their attention to him in that instance, and they had addresses and places of where he worked in the Brixton community, where he had rented. So that's what drew them to the Brixton community in that first instance. I spoke with some elders and said that this is what has happened and how I've been approached. And they were transparent and open. The employer of Zacarias Moussaoui was open to meeting these federal agents and also giving details of other elders who had rented to him. So the agents had flown out the following day to the Gambia, where some of our community had immigrated to ask questions. No one was suspected. No information was given other than factual information, which was there for everyone to know about rent, about employment. But we were very, very aware from that point on that the spotlight would be on the Brixton community, as it was. And it was a time of change for us, right up until present day. Referring to the remaining sermons now, before we move towards the conclusion. On the 21st of September, I continued the theme of the 14th of September, and this was about comparing the call of Ahl Sunnah, the people, mainstream Muslims, the people of Sunnah, versus the call of the Khawarij, the Kharijites, the extremists. On the 29th of September, I delivered the 11th sermon, and that was entitled "The Future is for Islam and the Need to be Balanced," because there was a lot of fear, There was a lot of despondency, there was a lot of anger, and I felt it necessary to deliver a sermon that would give assurances and hope, and also to quell the varying emotions amongst the wider communities. On the 12th of October, I delivered the 12th sermon, and that was in regard to the campaign that we saw against the Muslims. That was the perception that was there because of the media frenzy that was attacking Muslims in every aspect of our practice, our faith. And it was entitled, They Intend to Put Out the Light of Allah, the Crusades. And on the 26th of October, I delivered the 13th sermon entitled Responsibility. On the 7th of December, the 14th khutbah was given Patience and Its Virtues, Another Key to Paradise. And by the end of December, the 28th, I delivered a sermon that emphatically addressed the next major event that affected us in the community, and that was the resurfacing of Richard Reid, aka the Shoe Bomber, as he was more infamously known, and combating some of the allegations that came against us as informants and spies and the like, that had transferred from the 90s accusations of being in the pocket of the Saudi government and that we had scholars for dollars. This was the cry of the 90s. Now the extremists and their sympathizers had another accusation that they could proceed to, which was because of public statements of mine that we were open about our call and our chastisement of extremists, and our saying, and my saying, albeit naively, that the authorities were aware, they knew who we were, and they knew that those that were not ascribed to or attending our mosque in the local vicinity had different beliefs. But that did not equate to informing, spying, and the accusations that continue to abound from these detractors. That will be discussed in the next episode in more detail, but we will focus on, at this point, the Richard Reid Shoe Bomber affair. As I mentioned, this particular podcast is going to be slightly longer because these events all transpired in 2001, and it's important to keep them together within this podcast and not make it a two-part podcast on this occasion. Now, we first became aware of Richard Reid resurfacing, Abdulrahim resurfacing. I remember dropping my children to school on Christmas Day. The Muslim schools did not close, the private ones in particular, over the Christmas period. So I remember getting a phone call from the Times, and they were probing and inquiring about Richard Reid. Now, we became aware of Richard Reid a few days before. He was arrested on the 22nd of December. And on that day or the next morning, when I was driving into Brixton, a colleague called me and said, have you seen it in the news? I said, I haven't seen the news. He said, stop and get a paper. I stopped and got the paper. And on the front page was that picture of Richard Reid, Abdulrahim, that disheveled look with him in the back of the car, scowling with a hood on. And I went straight to Brixton to meet committee members, and we discussed what are we going to do at this juncture, because it wasn't known who he was. His identity was unknown at that particular time. We full well knew it, and decided we needed to make some steps to mitigate what would be coming. That newspaper journalist arranged to meet me. I mentioned to a few colleagues, not officially, that a journalist was coming. And somewhat naively, when he interviewed me and we spoke about Richard Reid, and I spoke about him being an amiable individual, when he converted to Islam, he came straight to Brixton. He used to be in the mosque, always wanting to help out, clean the mosque. He stayed overnight when he was homeless, and he would study the Quran classes and be a very active participant. So I gave that sort of impression about him. But when he started gravitating towards violent extremism or extremist ideological teachings, we asked him not to come back and know that he had attached himself elsewhere. That was some of the story to them. At the end of the day as well, I felt, okay, this is just a story. It's not going to blow up even more, somewhat naively with hindsight. And they took a picture which I requested be a silhouette because I didn't want my identity to be known. Again, indicating my naivety at that particular point. The next morning at Fajr, one of the committee members called me and said, we have got phone calls from the Canary Islands and from international outlets who want more of a story on Richard Reid following my interview in the Times. And I said, okay, I will come and we can sit and talk. And we said we'd meet at the end of the road because when we got there, the media were camped outside the front of the mosque. And we realized the magnitude of the story that was beginning to unfold. So we discussed our strategy on dealing with things, but we couldn't implement the strategy because the media said they're going to write their story. They knocked and said, if you don't give us a story, we're going to write the story. And we could envisage what that story was going to be about the Brixton Mosque being a hotbed of extremism, as some tried to accuse us. And we decided that we needed to rebut that and stop that story from growing. So without any strategic planning, without any extensive consultation, which I would have preferred on 9/11 when we met with the Religious Instruction Committee, the Dawah Committee, but they were not, didn't have the foresight or the urgency to see that we needed to have a statement ready from that time, which could be read all the way up until when this Richard Reid situation unfolded. Without going into further detail here, because that information's there, it's in the media. My PhD discusses it in the case study around Richard Reid and Zacarias Moussaoui. There are news interviews, so I don't want to rehash all of that now. What I would conclude on is that we gave our final sermon at the end of December, 28th of December, and the beginning of January, and it seemed at that point that we were going to have to keep rebutting and reacting to media stories that were coming. On the 26th of December, when the world media converged on the mosque, I was delivering interviews, being picked up by taxis to go to studios, being called, my number had got out internationally, being called by ABC News, who would put me on live and say, you're speaking to 25 million people now. NBC News would be calling me and saying, you've got 100 million that your list viewers now, and this is going out live. And with such lack of preparedness, I did what we could do to clarify what the correct Islam was, but in particular what Salafism was, because this was being highlighted as the extremists' modus operandi, as you were, and we were saying, no, it couldn't be further from the truth in that instance. So this continued, and it continued to spiral into 2002. And at this point, I will conclude by saying that for all of us, the Muslim world, the wider Western non-Muslim world, the world had changed emphatically by the events of September 11. And everyone was impacted in airports, especially by the attempted attack of Richard Reid, in that we all had to remove our shoes at the airport to be checked. And again, this was as a result of his thwarted terrorist attack. And a little bit on Richard Reid. I spoke about him and his amiable character. He was also not a forerunner or front runner in bravery, should I say. So I believe, my personal belief is that he wanted to get caught when trying to enact the ignition of his trainers, bomb in his trainers. Because if he didn't want to get caught, he could have easily have gone into the toilets and caused the destruction that he wanted to do there. And that remains one of my considerations. And I do not see any premise on which that can be countered. And I will conclude at this point.